Now what the hell do you think you're doing with that tin star, boy?
Watch that boy shit, redneck. You talking to the sheriff of Rock Ridge.
There's something about Blazing Saddles that keeps pulling people back, even 50 years after it first hit theaters. Most people assume they know the story by now, the outrageous humor, the boundary-pushing satire, the unforgettable characters. But here's the thing. The detail that actually made this film work, the one that separated it from every other comedy of its era, has been sitting right in front of audiences this entire time, and almost nobody caught it. Gene Wilder, in his own quiet and understated way, eventually confirmed what it was. And once you understand it, you will never watch Blazing Saddles the same way again. Because the secret to one of the loudest, most chaotic comedies ever made wasn't the jokes. It was one man's decision to say almost nothing at all. Most people who love Blazing Saddles love it for the obvious reasons. They love the campfire scene. They love the fourth wall-breaking finale. They love Hedley Lamar's pompous scheming and Mongo punching a horse. These are the moments that get quoted at dinner tables and replayed on late-night television. But ask any serious film critic or comedy writer what actually holds the entire film together, and they'll point you somewhere quieter. They'll point you to a man lying in a jail cell bunk, barely awake, delivering lines with the energy of someone who has completely given up on the world. That man is Gene Wilder, playing Jim, the Waco Kid. And the choice he made before he even walked onto that set changed the entire film in ways that nobody fully appreciated at the time. To understand why Wilder's performance was so remarkable, you first have to understand the circumstances that put him there in the first place. The role of the Waco Kid was not originally written for Gene Wilder. Mel Brooks had cast Gig Young, an experienced Hollywood actor who had won an Academy Award for his work in They Shoot Horses, Don't They? Young seemed like a natural choice for the role of a washed-up, world-weary gunslinger. He had the gravitas, the name recognition, and the kind of weathered screen presence that the character seemed to demand. On paper, it made complete sense. In reality, things fell apart on the very first day of production. When Gig Young arrived on set, it became clear almost immediately that something was seriously wrong. He was visibly shaking, struggling to remember his lines, and unable to maintain composure in front of the camera. What the crew had initially hoped might be nerves turned out to be something far more serious. Young was in the grip of acute alcohol withdrawal, a medical condition that can be genuinely dangerous and debilitating. By mid-morning, he had collapsed entirely, and production came to a halt. The studio faced a significant problem, and Mel Brooks needed a solution fast. Brooks made a phone call to Gene Wilder, someone he had worked with closely on The Producers a few years earlier. Their creative relationship was built on genuine trust, the kind that develops not just from professional respect, but from a shared understanding of what comedy can and should do. Brooks explained the situation, and according to accounts from those close to both men, Wilder did not ask many questions. He didn't negotiate. He didn't demand to see the full script or press for details about compensation. He simply agreed to come, and he was on set within 24 hours. What happened next is where the real story begins. Because most actors, dropped into a film with almost no preparation time, would do one of two things. They would either overcompensate by going big and loud, trying to grab the audience's attention through sheer force of personality, or they would play it safe and simply follow whatever tone the film had already established. Wilder did neither. Instead, before he even arrived on set, he had already made a decision about how he was going to play Jim, the Waco Kid. And that decision, more than any scripted joke or choreographed scene, is what makes Blazing Saddles the film it is. Wilder told Mel Brooks he was not going to play the character for laughs. In a film absolutely saturated with broad comedy, physical gags, outrageous satire, and deliberately provocative humor, Wilder's condition for taking the role was that he would play his character as a real person, not as a comedic figure, not as a sidekick designed to feed punchlines to the lead. He would play Jim as a genuinely broken man, someone whose best days were behind him, whose relationship with alcohol was not a quirk, but a symptom of something deeply painful. He would play the tragedy straight and let the comedy take care of itself. This was a genuinely risky, creative choice. In the context of Blazing Saddles, where almost everything is pitched at maximum volume and nothing is treated with particular reverence, a restrained and emotionally grounded performance could easily have been swallowed whole. It could have registered as flat or disengaged. It could have made the character seem like he belonged in a different, more serious film. In the wrong hands, the approach would have been a disaster. But Wilder understood something that very few comedic actors of his generation had fully internalized, which is that in comedy, contrast is everything. When you place genuine human sadness inside a frame of pure absurdity, something interesting happens. The sadness doesn't disappear. It deepens the absurdity, and the absurdity deepens the sadness. The two work on each other in ways that make both more powerful than they would be alone. Wilder's Waco Kid is a man who has seen everything and been defeated by it, and because he is placed inside a film that is gleefully tearing apart the mythology of the American West, his exhaustion reads as something more than personal. It reads as philosophical. He is not just a drunk with a sad past. He is a man who looked at the world, understood it completely, and decided the only reasonable response was to stop caring. The famous jail cell scene, where Jim and Bart first meet and Jim explains the tremors in his hands and the collapse of his nerve, is often cited as one of the finest pieces of comedic acting in American film history. But watch it closely, and you'll notice that Wilder isn't playing it as comedy at all. His voice is quiet, almost confessional. His eyes carry the specific blankness of someone who has made peace with their own disappointment. When he describes once being the fastest draw in the West, there's no nostalgia in it, no wink to the audience. There's only the flat, matter-of-fact tone of someone describing a life that belongs to a stranger. The scene is funny because of what surrounds it and because of Cleveland Little's reactions, but Wilder himself is playing it as though it's the saddest thing he's ever had to say. That tension is what makes it land so hard. What's also worth understanding about this performance is how it reflects Wilder's own personality and working philosophy. People who spent time with him on various productions consistently described him as someone who was deeply invested in emotional truth, someone who found excessive showiness in performance somewhat vulgar. He was methodical and thoughtful, and he had enormous respect for the intelligence of audiences. He didn't believe in telegraphing jokes or holding for laughs. He believed that if you did the work honestly, the audience would do the rest. In The Waco Kid, this philosophy found perhaps its purest expression. Wilder gives you the character completely and then trusts you to understand why it's funny and why it's heartbreaking at the same time. Mel Brooks, who was not exactly known for his own restraint as a filmmaker, later spoke with genuine admiration about what Wilder brought to the film. He acknowledged that The Waco Kid's emotional grounding gave Blazing Saddles something it might not have survived without a center. The film could afford to go completely insane in every other direction precisely because there was one character in it who remained recognizably human. Every time the absurdity threatened to collapse under its own weight, a scene with Wilder would reset the film's emotional gravity. He was the eye of the hurricane, completely still while everything else spun wildly around him. There's also a layer to this performance that many viewers completely miss on first viewing. Wilder made a deliberate choice to portray the Waco Kid's alcoholism and his physical deterioration not as comic exaggeration, but as something with real psychological weight. The shaking hands, the difficulty focusing, the way Jim seems to occupy a slightly different emotional frequency than everyone else in the film. These were not played as slapstick. They were played as the visible symptoms of a man who had experienced something genuinely traumatic and had never found a way to process it. Wilder gave the character a backstory that the script barely suggests, a whole history of loss and failure that you can feel in every scene, even though it's never fully explained. This depth became even more visible to people who worked on the film behind the camera. Several crew members have spoken over the years about the unusual difficulty of filming scenes with Wilder, not because he was difficult to work with, but because his delivery was so unexpected and so precisely timed that people simply couldn't stay composed. Camera operators broke. Sound technicians had to step outside. In at least one instance, Mel Brooks himself had to be removed from the set because his laughter was audible on the audio track. This was not happening because Wilder was doing something broadly comedic. It was happening because his deadpan was so complete, so committed, and so perfectly placed that it ambushed people who thought they were prepared for it. There's a line Wilder delivers when he describes the townsp, Opal of Rock Ridge, and it is possibly the most quietly devastating joke in the entire film. He delivers it with absolute sincerity, with a patient tone of someone explaining something genuinely obvious, and the contrast between the gravity of his delivery and the content of what he's saying is so perfectly calibrated that the moment has become one of the most quoted in comedy history. But the reason it works is not the words themselves. It's the complete absence of irony in Wilder's voice. He's not winking. He's not performing. He's just stating what he observes. And somehow that makes it funnier than any exaggerated punchline ever could. Beyond his performance, Wilder also played a significant quiet role in the production's survival during moments of tension with the studio. Warner Brothers was deeply uncomfortable with much of the film's content, particularly its unflinching racial satire and its willingness to use language and situations that no studio comedy had really attempted before. There were internal pressures to soften the script, to pull back from the film's more confrontational moments, to make the comedy feel safer and more palatable. Brooks resisted these pressures, and Wilder stood behind him in doing so. Not publicly or dramatically, but in the way Wilder did most things, quietly and firmly. Wilder understood what was at stake. A Blazing Saddles, with the edges sanded off, would not have been a safer film. It would have been a dishonest one. The entire point of the satire was to make audiences confront the absurdity and ugliness of racism by presenting it through the lens of comedy. Pulling that apart would have left something toothless and pointless. Wilder, who had a deep belief in comedy as a vehicle for genuine social observation, was not willing to see that compromised. His support gave Brooks credibility in those difficult conversations, and it helped preserve the film in the form that audiences eventually saw and fell in love with. It is also worth noting that the set of Blazing Saddles is where the seed of Young Frankenstein was planted. During breaks in filming, Wilder began sharing an idea he had been turning over in his mind, a story about the descendant of the famous doctor who wanted nothing to do with his family's monstrous legacy. Brooks was initially dismissive, too focused on the challenges already in front of him to give much attention to new pitches. But Wilder was persistent, and he eventually wrote a draft on his own, without any guarantee that it would go anywhere. When Brooks finally sat down and read it, his response changed quickly. Young Frankenstein went into production not long after, and it became one of the defining comedy films of the 1970s. None of that happens without the creative partnership and the downtime that Blazing Saddles provided. What Gene Wilder ultimately revealed about Blazing Saddles, not in a single interview or dramatic announcement, but through his choices and through the reflections of those who worked alongside him, is that the film's lasting power comes from something much quieter than its loudest moments. The campfire scene gets the biggest laughs. The finale gets the most attention. But the Waco Kid is what makes the film matter. He is the character who reminds you, even in the middle of all the glorious chaos, that the story is actually about something. He carries the film's emotional logic on his slumped shoulders, and he does it so effortlessly that most audiences never even notice it's happening. That invisibility was the point. Great supporting work doesn't announce itself. It creates the conditions for everything else to succeed. In Blazing Saddles, Gene Wilder did exactly that. He arrived with almost no preparation in the middle of a production crisis and proceeded to give one of the most technically sophisticated comedic performances of his generation, a performance built entirely on restraint, emotional honesty, and an almost radical trust in the audience's ability to meet him where he was. Decades later, the film endures not just because it was brave and funny and culturally significant, but because somewhere in the middle of its magnificent absurdity, a man in a jail cell bunk is quietly breaking your heart. And that, as Gene Wilder understood better than almost anyone, is the oldest trick in comedy's book.